Hi, this is Matt Pullen again, and this time I would like to talk to you about the Neo-Steinitz defense in the Ruy Lopez. So let me start out with a nice Ruy Lopez here, bishop to b5. And last time I talked about the old Steinitz defense, d6, on this move. And this is a bit passive because white can force black to give up the center by playing d4, as we saw in the last video that I made. Well, let's play a different move this time. Let's play a6, which is by far the most popular move against the Ruy Lopez. Now this offers white two basic choices. He can capture on c6, which leads to the Ruy Lopez exchanged, or he can go back to a4, which leads to all the other lines of the Ruy Lopez. And in this position, typically black plays knight to f6 to put pressure on the pawn on e4, and this transposes into most of the Ruy Lopez theory. But in this position, let's say black plays pawn to d6. Now this is the Neo-Steinitz defense. And the Neo-Steinitz is just like the Steinitz, except for the moves a6 and bishop a4 are thrown in. Against the Neo-Steinitz, white usually plays c3 in order to prepare the d4 pawn push, or he castles. Against the old Steinitz, we saw that white could force black to give up the center by playing d4 immediately. Well, what if he just plays this here? The difference is that black can play b5 to break the pin on the knight on c6. And this almost forces white to move the bishop back to b3. If white advances the pawn with a counterattack on the knight on c6, the knight just goes to a5. And then the bishop has to come to b3. And then, whenever black wants to, he can capture the bishop on b3 and get the two bishops. But there's no need to do that right away because the bishop isn't going anywhere. Black should play f5 immediately to start the undermining of the white pawn chain, and continue with developing moves like bishop to e7, knight to f6, and castles. So d5 right away is not dangerous for black. So let's say the bishop goes to b3, and the pawn on d4 should be taken by black, but pawn takes is not very wise because the game Medley-Mongradian from 1850 showed that bishop to d5 is a very nasty move because it pins the knight on c6, which is unprotected, to the rook. So after bishop to b7 to defend the knight, knight takes d4 puts more pressure on the pinned piece. Black defended with the knight to e7, and then white played bishop to g5 to pin the knight that was defending the knight. So white is threatening to win material with knight takes c6. So Mongradian played f6 to break the pin on the knight on e7, and then Medley jumped the knight into e6, and the queen moved up, and bishop e3. And this is a very serious bind for black. White controls a lot of space, and he's got this knight on e6, which is going to be very hard to remove. And black cannot castle, because the knight controls both squares to the left and right of the king. So it's a very difficult position to play. But there's no need to play pawn takes when black can play knight takes here. It leads to the same things, but it avoids the bishop to d5 move, because bishop to d5 does nothing here. So the only move that makes sense is knight takes knight, and then pawn takes, and this is a critical position in the Neo-Steinitz. The most important thing to be aware of is that queen takes pawn is unplayable because of something called the Noah's Ark trap. Black plays pawn to c5, and he's attacking the queen and also threatening to play pawn to c4, trapping the bishop. So the white queen goes to d5, threatening the rook on a8, and also checkmate. So So to guard both of them, black plays bishop to e6 to guard the rook and also attack the queen. So the queen goes to c6 check, and then the bishop blocks, and the queen goes back to d5, threatening mate. But the difference here is that the rook on a8 is not hanging, so black simply plays c4 and shuts the door on the bishop to b3. This is called the Noah's Ark trap, where the bishop swings back to b3 and gets trapped with pawns like this. So white cannot take on d4 because he gets Noah's Arked. So what about the bishop to d5 move first, attacking the rook on a8? Well, this move, as it turns out, forces the rook to go to b8. If the rook goes to a7, then white has this very strong move, bishop to c6 check. And then if the bishop blocks, queen takes d4, attacks the rook, which has nowhere to go. So in order to avoid losing the exchange, black would have to play queen b8. And this leads to a very difficult position where black's major pieces are misplaced. So rook to a7 is a poor move. Most of the time black plays rook to b8. And this line could go bishop to c6 check, bishop blocks, bishop takes, queen takes, knight f6. And this is also perfectly fine for black, because he's going to play c5 to gain time on the queen, followed by bishop e7 and castle kingside. Black really doesn't have any serious weaknesses here. So that is a possibility after bishop to d5 and rook b8. Now let's say white just castles, and black plays c5 to hold on to the pawn on d4. Well, let's say this bishop goes into d5 again, which has been weakened by black playing pawn to c5. Now that there's already a pawn on c5, the rook does not need to go to b8. The rook can go to a7, which is actually very advantageous for black, because say pawn to c3 gets played, forcing black to take, and then white takes, knight f6, bishop g5, bishop e7, bishop check, bishop takes, and then black can play rook takes. This is a good position for him because he's up a pawn, and the rook on d7 is very influential in the center. This maneuver reminds me a lot of the Poljeski variation in the Najdorf Sicilian, where the rook goes to a7 and then to d7. So that is a satisfactory defense for black if white castles. Black should play c5 and hold on to the d4 pawn. Well, the best move for white is to play c3. And I don't have time in this video to go into all the lines after c3 because it's very complicated. But the most important thing to know is that pawn takes pawn allows white to get a draw at will by playing queen to d5. Not just knight takes, that leads to a very ordinary position. But queen to d5 threatens the rook and also mate, forcing the bishop to go to e6. And now queen to c6 check, and the bishop blocks, and then queen to d5 again, threatening mate, and the only way to avoid this mate is to block, and then white can keep on checking all day long. And unless black wants to play something terrible like king to e7 to compromise his position, he'll just have to shake hands and agree to a draw. So really, instead of pawn takes pawn, bishop to b7 should be played, and this leads to very complicated positions after, say, pawn takes pawn, bishop takes, castles, bishop e7, knight c3, bishop b7, and queen h5. Black is up a pawn, but white has a lot of compensation. So that has been a brief look at the Neo-Steinitz defense with 5d4 in the Ruy Lopez. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you next time.